If you want to learn simple techniques for making delicious sourdough bread at home, then keep watching this video. The foundation of your sourdough bread is your sourdough starter culture. So this is a collection of yeast and bacteria that live in flour and the air surrounding us that, when you combine with more flour and water, it will produce a fermentation reaction when held at a certain temperature. As you can see, it has visibly risen in the jar. There's tons of bubbles on the sides and on the top, and these are all signs of an active fermentation. So the same thing you saw take place in the jar, that's going to take place in your bread. So without this active starter, if it's not fermenting properly, you can follow every step of the recipe perfectly, and your bread will not turn out the way you want it to, and it may even be inedible. So this is the key step in making your bread, and it's the first step. I always use my sourdough starter after it has been fed and after I see a visible rise. There are so many variables that can affect the way your dough comes together and the final product of your dough. So the type of flour you use, the brand of flour you use, how much water you use, the humidity in the air in your environment, the altitude you're at. These all can greatly impact the texture of your bread and the final product. So you may have to tailor the recipe in order to get the results you want. So try to really observe the texture of the bread and mix your flour and water until you obtain the same kind of similar texture that you're seeing on the screen. Even if that means you may have to add a little bit less water, or you may have to add a little bit more water, or whichever variable you want to manipulate. If you want to manipulate the flour, add a little bit more flour or add a little bit less flour. After you have mixed your dough together, the next phase of your sourdough process is gluten development. So this is called a stretch and fold. So I take one side of the dough and lift it up and stretch it as far as I can without ripping it, and then fold it back over on itself. And I try to get the dough into a ball. Then you want to cover your dough and let it relax before you go in with more manipulation. This is called a coil fold. And so this is another way you can fold the dough in on itself. You just lift it from the middle or lift it from one side, stretch it out, and then let the dough collapse in on itself. And then keep turning the bowl and go around every corner, and then you should end up with a ball at the end. Then you see here, this is just another stretching and folding technique. It's a dough lamination, but I just did it in my hands instead of stretching the dough out on the counter. And this is a great example. You can see I overstretched the dough a little bit. You can see on the top how it kind of looks kind of rough. That's a rip in the dough. But it's not the end of the world. I just know that I do not need to continue manipulating it. Just cover it, and when you let it sit, the gluten bonds will reform. As you are manipulating the dough, you're going to start to feel that it gets tighter, and this is going to be your cue to stop. This dough right now at this stage is holding its shape pretty well, and I'll probably do maybe one more coil fold, or I could stop here. There is no right or wrong. There is no set amount. It depends on you, your schedule, and what your goal is for the particular loaf you're making. But breads that have more water in it, they're going to require more manipulation to be able to hold its shape and form strong gluten bonds. So gluten is just the protein in bread flour that gives the bread structure. And breads that have the proper gluten formation, they rise. If your bread is lacking gluten formation, you will notice that it will probably be a little on the flatter side. But like I stated earlier in the video, as long as you have a sourdough starter that is fermenting bread properly, your bread will probably still taste good, it just might be a little flat. While I'm letting the dough go through its first rise, I'm going to prep these proofing baskets. And the round one you see me holding is made out of wood. And then the oval one you see me holding is silicone. I personally like the bamboo proofing basket over the silicone just because the silicone, I always have issues with the bread sticking. And these are also called bannetons, and you do not have to purchase one of these to make your sourdough bread. You can use a bowl or even a pot. Just line it with a kitchen towel and you shouldn't have any problems with it sticking. So this is about 8 hours later. The dough has almost filled this bowl, and this is a 5-quart bowl. If you are a beginner sourdough baker, I highly recommend you use the same recipe and the same size bowl until you figure out what is the perfect volume that you need to let your dough rise to in order to produce the desired texture that you are going for. This process is highly temperature dependent, so the higher the temperature, the faster the dough will rise. I recommend letting your dough rise at a temp in the low 70s because there are multiple time frames that you can let your dough progress and still get great results. Whereas if you're letting your dough rise in a temperature in the 80s or higher, the dough could be fermenting so fast that it can overproof much easier, and it may not give you a great rise in the oven. The longer you let the fermentation process take place, the easier your bread will be to digest when you consume it. So I'm going to make 2 loaves out of this bread, and right now I'm doing what is called a pre-shape, and this is just another way of adding structure to your dough. So I'm going to take the corners of the dough and bring it to the center to create a ball, and then I'm going to gently push it forwards, backwards, side to side on the counter until it forms a ball. The first loaf I left plain, but the second loaf I wanted to try some inclusions. So this will be a white cheddar and dill loaf. You can add your inclusions at any point you want. You can add it during your stretch and folds. You can wait and add it at this point. Just try and experiment and see which one you like better. I'm going to do the exact same thing. Take the corners of the dough and bring it to the center. But with each fold of the dough, I'm going to be adding inclusions in it. And this is in an effort to disperse the inclusions throughout the bread and not just have them all in the center or all in one point of the bread, because that has happened to me before. And this bread dough is really cold because it was a very cold day. So I did not add any flour whenever I'm doing this shaping process because the dough was not sticking to the countertop. But depending on how much water you add to your bread and the temperature of the dough, your dough could be stickier than what you see in this video. If it is, just keep going, but add some flour to your countertop and continue with the folding techniques you see in the video, and your dough will form into a tight ball. the tight balls, I'm just going to cover them with a towel and let them relax. And even at this point, your bread is still fermenting, it's still rising. So I would let this step go on just until you can see that your dough has visibly relaxed, and you should see it spread out on the counter. The dough with the inclusions, you'll see me just adding a little bit more, and I am going to shape this in what is called a batard. This is an oval shape, and the technique I used in this video is a very simplified technique. There are so many different sourdough shaping techniques, but this one is really simple and it's effective. So after I finished including all my inclusions, just flatten the dough a little bit, start from one end of the dough and just roll it over. The dough was so tight, you're going to be able to feel the dough tighten up with each fold. The dough was so tight, I just decided to leave it here. I didn't have to do any more manipulation to it. So I just sprinkled the top with some rice flour and put it into the banneton, and then it was ready for its final rise. The second loaf, I'm going to leave in a circular shape, and that is called a boule. So you're going to see a big difference between this dough and the previous dough that I did. It's way more flexible. So I started off folding it exactly the same way I folded the first loaf, but in order to achieve the round shape, I did a series of folds going from left to right. And then I just moved the dough back and forth around the counter, and this is going to really create a lot of surface tension on that smooth side of the dough, and that's what you want at the end of your shaping session before you put it into the proofing basket for its final rise. And this is an extra step that I like to do sometimes with my bread. It's called stitching the dough. So you basically take parallel opposing edges of the dough and you bring them to the center where they meet to stitch them together. So if you've used a lot of flour during your folding process, and if you've gotten flour on this surface of the bread, then it's not going to stick, but that's okay. This step is completely optional. The point is to try and create a lot of tightness and a lot of structure in your bread before you place them in the basket, and you should be fine. Then you cover the dough and let it rise for the final time before it's time to bake. These are both 10-inch bannetons at their widest point, and as you can see with this recipe I let the dough rise well above the brim of both of these. So this will just be trial and error for you to figure out what you like and the desired texture you want for your bread. I'm doing the poke test here just to show you what proofed bread looks like and how it'll feel whenever you are you're ready to move on to the next step to bake. When you poke it, it should spring back just slightly. It shouldn't be too fast. And if it if when you poke the bread and it kind of sinks in and doesn't come back at all, that is a sign that your bread may be overproofed. But overproofed bread can still taste really good. So I would just, just keep moving forward and then you'll know next time when you bake. And another thing is the poke test, it's only reliable on room temperature bread. So if your bread is cold, like if you put it in the refrigerator, which you absolutely can, you can put your bread dough in the refrigerator. The poke test will not be reliable. So go ahead and preheat your oven to at least 450 degrees for at least 40 minutes. I used a Dutch oven to cook my bread in, but you can use anything that has a lid on it. Just make sure you preheat it as well. Then score your bread from one end to the other, and you want to do a deep score, about an inch deep. And I find it easiest to use a razor blade, but you can use a knife, you can use scissors to score your bread, and it'll turn out just fine. And scoring your bread is important because you're giving your bread a place to rise. So you don't have to score your bread at all, but your bread may burst on the side and it may come out looking a little bit irregular. And as you can see, I had a little bit of issue with the bread sticking in the silicone basket, even though I did line it with rice flour. So I think next time I'm just gonna line it with a kitchen towel, because it seems like for some reason the silicone, I have more issues with it sticking than my other Banneton, and when I use a regular bowl with a kitchen towel. And I'm just going to score the same way I did before, about an inch deep from end to end. And I baked the first loaf in a Dutch oven covered for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then I took the lid off and baked it again for another 20 to 30 minutes. I usually take an internal temp on the bread just to be 100% sure that it's finished cooking all the way through. And the internal temp I look for is 190 to 210 degrees. And this loaf, I actually experimented with open baking. So I just put it on a pizza steel in my oven, and I had a cast iron pan on the bottom rack with ice to create some steam in the oven. And I think it turned out well. And I love the design that the bannetons give on the bread with the lines. And before you slice into your bread, let it cool down completely, because if you cut into it right when it comes out of the oven, it could affect the texture of your bread. And I highly recommend using a serrated bread knife whenever you're cutting into a country loaf like this. It really does make it so much easier. If your knife that you have is not long enough to cut through the bread like I just showed, go ahead and cut it in half again, and then you should be able to slice normally using a standard kitchen knife. And the bread was nice and fluffy and soft and everything that you would want in a sourdough bread. I hope that you will try out this recipe and let me know how it goes for you in the comments. And if you have any more questions, you can leave them down below. Thank you for watching. I'll see you later. Bye.